The signal died at exactly the wrong moment. For the people watching from inside the Vatican press room, it looked at first like a technical problem. A flicker, a pause, a thin gray bar on the monitor. Then the live feed from the Clementine Hall went black. No explanation appeared on screen. No Vatican technician stepped forward. No spokesperson walked to the microphone. For 7 seconds, there was only the hum of the lights, the clicking of confused laptops, and the sound of journalists turning toward one another with the same question in their eyes. What did he just say? Inside the hall, Pope Leo XIV was still speaking. The cameras had cut away, but the room had not escaped the sentence that had landed there like a stone through stained glass. "The church is not dying because the world has become too strong," he had said. "The church is rotting because too many of her shepherds learned how to hide." That was the line. That was when the feed vanished. And that was when everyone in Rome understood that the speech had stopped being ceremonial. It had become evidence. 23 minutes earlier, the event had looked harmless. A scheduled conference, a gathering of officials from the Pontifical Council for the Doctrine of the Faith, regional representatives from dioceses across the world, selected journalists, a few lay observers, and a row of bishops who expected one more polished address about renewal, synodality, and pastoral responsibility. The kind of address Rome knows how to survive. The kind of address that sounds serious, produces headlines for one afternoon, and disappears into the archives by dinner. But Leo XIV did not enter the hall like a man preparing to deliver another institutional meditation. He entered alone. No thick folder in his hands, no ceremonial procession behind him, no line of assistants carrying prepared copies. He wore the white cassock, plain and unadorned, and in his right hand he carried only a small black notebook, whose corners had been worn soft from use. Several people in the room noticed the notebook. They would remember it later. He reached the lectern, looked at the prepared microphone, and then pushed it slightly aside, as if even the equipment had been arranged for the wrong kind of speech. For several seconds he said nothing. That silence worked on the room before his words did. It was not a devotional silence. It was not the silence of prayer before a blessing. It was the silence that comes when people begin to suspect that the man in front of them has not come to reassure them. Then Pope Leo XIV opened the notebook, looked once at the page, closed it again, and began without greeting. "Today I do not speak as a diplomat." A few heads lifted. "Today I speak as a shepherd." He paused. The room waited. And a shepherd who knows wolves are near the flock cannot spend the morning discussing the weather. The sentence was quiet. It was not theatrical, but it moved through the hall with the force of a warning. A bishop from Central Europe shifted in his chair. A laywoman from Chile, seated 3 rows from the back, gripped the edge of her notebook so hard that the paper bent under her hand. Leo looked across the room, not quickly, not vaguely, but face by face. The kind of look that makes an audience stop feeling like an audience and start feeling named. Then he said the words that would be replayed millions of times before nightfall. "The church is not dying because of attacks from the outside. It is rotting from within. And if we do not act now with urgency and courage, we will become helpless witnesses to our own collapse." No one applauded. No one moved. For a moment, Rome itself seemed to hold its breath. Then came the line about hiding. Then the cameras went dark. And that was the mistake. Because the people who cut the signal forgot one thing. There were phones in the room. Recorders, journalists, translators, young observers who had grown up in a world where nothing spoken aloud in public belongs only to the powerful for more than a few seconds. By the time the Vatican feed disappeared, the speech had already escaped. A 14-second clip was uploaded from the back row. Then a 37-second clip. Then the full audio, shaky and imperfect, but clear enough. Within minutes, Catholic group chats in Manila, Sao Paulo, Chicago, Lagos, Krakow, and Buenos Aires were carrying the same words. By the time the Vatican press office issued a neutral statement about temporary technical difficulties, the world had already heard the Pope accuse his own house of rot. And the day was only beginning. To understand why that sentence shook Rome so deeply, you have to understand what had been happening behind the walls for months. Pope Leo XIV had not arrived in the papacy as an unknown man, born Giancarlo Bellini in Florence, formed first by philosophy and then by missionary work in the poorest neighborhoods of Latin America. He had always unsettled people who mistook quietness for obedience. He had the habits of a scholar, the eyes of a pastor, and the patience of a man who knew that institutions do not confess until the evidence has already become memorable. He had lived in places where church power looked very different from Rome. In the marble corridors of the Vatican, power moves through appointments, signatures, titles, lunches, and sealed doors. In the neighborhoods where Bellini served before his election, power was simpler and harsher. A mother deciding whether to buy bread or medicine, a child walking past gang territory to reach school. A priest standing beside a family after a funeral no one could afford. A grandmother keeping a plastic statue of the Virgin on a shelf because everything else in her house had been taken by poverty, sickness, or fear. That history shaped him. It also made him dangerous, because Leo XIV had seen the church at its most believable, in places where it had no influence to protect. And once a pope has seen that, the palaces begin to look different. In his first months, he did not move loudly. He changed small things. He asked why certain accounts had never been audited by outside professionals. He asked why some abuse files were kept in sealed cabinets, accessible only to men who had never spoken to survivors. He asked why some nunciatures had budgets larger than diocesan hospitals in poor regions. He asked why bishops accused of negligence could retire quietly with honors, while the wounded were expected to accept carefully worded apologies. At first, the Curia responded the way old systems always respond to new questions, politely, slowly. With committees, a report was promised, then delayed, then revised, then sent back for additional context. A financial review was opened, then narrowed. A draft protocol for abuse accountability was circulated, then softened with footnotes so dense that even the people responsible for implementing it could no longer say what it required. Leo watched. He did not react quickly. That too was misread. Inside certain offices, people began saying that the new pope had moral passion, but no administrative will. That he would speak well, but not strike. That he would raise concerns, but eventually accept the wisdom of Rome, which in Vatican language often means the ability to bury a crisis under procedure until everyone is too exhausted to continue. They believed they had time. They were wrong. 10 days before the speech, at 6:12 in the morning, a sealed packet was carried to the papal apartment by a lay auditor whose name appeared on no public schedule. The packet was cream-colored, tied with a thin red ribbon, and labeled in Latin with 2 words, Ecclesia Nuda, the naked church. Inside were copies of documents Leo had requested quietly over the previous 6 months. Financial transfers, internal correspondence, survivor testimonies, memos from bishops who had warned Rome and been ignored, reports of diocesan assets moved into private foundations, draft letters that had been changed before release to remove names and dates, payments described as pastoral assistance, but linked to silence agreements. The packet was not everything. It did not need to be. It was enough to prove a pattern. Leo read it alone. Then he read it again with a pencil in hand. On the 3rd reading, according to one person familiar with the preparation, he underlined the same phrase on 3 different pages. Reputational risk. That was the language that broke something in him. Not human suffering, not sin, not wound, not child, not truth. Reputational risk. The institution had found a phrase that allowed it to speak about ruined lives, as if they were public relations complications. By noon that day, Leo had begun writing in the black notebook. Not a speech. A confession. That is why, when he stood in the Clementine Hall, he did not sound like a man improvising. He sounded like a man who had decided that the old language was no longer fit for the wound. After the cameras cut, he continued. "We are losing entire generations," he said. "And we have told ourselves it is because the world is secular, because young people are distracted, because families no longer pray, because the culture no longer respects sacred things. There is truth in some of that, but it is not the deepest truth." He leaned slightly toward the room. "The deepest truth is this. Many have stopped listening to us because we stopped sounding like Jesus." That sentence wounded more than the first one, because it was not a political accusation. It was a spiritual one. We preach morality and then hide corruption. We speak of compassion and then treat wounded people as problems to be managed. We praise poverty while protecting comfort. We call ourselves shepherds, but sometimes we behave like owners of the flock. Then he stopped, not because he had lost his place, because the next line would name the wound no institution once named in a room full of witnesses. "And we speak of the innocence of children," he said, his voice low. while too many of our files contain the evidence of what was done to them and what was done afterward to protect the men who did it. A sound moved through the hall. Not a gasp exactly. Something more contained, more human, the sound people make when the truth arrives without enough warning. Several bishops lowered their eyes. One cardinal in the second row stared at the floor and did not look up again for almost 10 minutes. Leo did not spare them. Where were the leaders when children came forward and were not believed? Where were the men who swore before God to protect the vulnerable? Were they praying, were they listening, or were they writing statements, moving priests, closing files, and purchasing silence with money offered by the faithful for the work of the gospel? The room had no answer, and because there was no answer, the Pope gave one. This ends now. From the black notebook, he unfolded a single page. It was not printed on official letterhead. It had been written by hand and copied only that morning. Today I announce the creation of an independent international tribunal for cases of clerical abuse, cover-up, and institutional negligence. It will not be composed only of clerics. It will include women. It will include survivors. It will include experts in law, trauma, human rights, and canon law. It will have access to archives that have too long been protected by the language of prudence. It will have authority to investigate any member of the clergy, regardless of rank, title, or influence. Then came the sentence that froze the old guard. I will be subject to it as well. No one expected that. Popes had apologized before. Popes had issued norms. Popes had called for purification. But Leo XIV had just placed the papacy itself under the moral logic of accountability. That was more than reform. It was a shift in gravity. A lay representative from Argentina began to cry silently. A priest from Ghana stood and applauded once, then stopped, uncertain whether protocol allowed him to continue. Then others joined him. The applause rose unevenly at first, then with force. It came from the back of the room before it came from the front. It came from observers before it came from bishops. It came from people who had waited years to hear one sentence, spoken without footnotes. No one is above the truth. But the Pope was not finished. The second matter, he said, returning to the notebook, is money. The applause died. He let the new silence form. Every nunciature, every diocese, every Vatican-linked institution handling funds in the name of the Church will submit to annual external financial audits by independent organizations with no ecclesiastical dependency. A cardinal near the front whispered something to the man beside him. Leo heard the whisper. He did not respond to the man. He responded to the room. Do not tell me this is impossible. It is not impossible to track money. It is only inconvenient for those who have benefited from darkness. A few people shifted uncomfortably. The Pope continued. The Institute for the Works of Religion, the Vatican Bank, and every structure connected to it will cooperate. There will be no sacred fog around accounts. There will be no financial mystery baptized as prudence. Christ did not die on a cross so that men in pious robes could behave like bankers hiding behind God. That line detonated outside the room as soon as the audio reached social media. Within an hour, it would be printed in headlines from Rome to New York. But inside the hall, what mattered was not the headline. It was the way several officials stopped taking notes. They knew what the line meant. He was not threatening reform. He was beginning it. Then came the third announcement, the one that would ignite the theological war. The Church will open a formal path for the ordination of married men where pastoral necessity and vocational integrity require it, Leo said. And we will begin, without fear and without forbidden questions, a theological process on the role of women in ministry. He raised his hand before the reaction could break open. No more taboos that suffocate the spirit. No more using the phrase, "This is how it has always been," as a substitute for discernment. Tradition is not a locked room. It is a living river. If it stops moving, it becomes a swamp. That was when several men stood and walked out. Not dramatically, not all at once. One bishop first, then another, then a cardinal whose name would soon become a rallying point for the opposition. Their footsteps were quiet, but in that room they sounded like thunder. Leo watched them leave. He did not call them back. He did not accuse them. He returned to the microphone and said, Jesus confronted the Pharisees not to destroy the law, but to purify it of hypocrisy. Today, I am not destroying the Church. I am shaking her with brotherly love. Sometimes the holiest act inside a temple is not to preserve every table. Sometimes it is to overturn the ones that have blocked the light. When he finished, he did not wait for applause. He closed the black notebook, stepped away from the lectern, and left through the side door. The hall remained seated. No one knew whether the event had ended. For almost half a minute, the room had no authority except the silence he had left behind. Outside, Rome began to burn without fire. By midday, St. Peter's Square was no longer a tourist space. It had become a battlefield of emotion. Pilgrims stood beside journalists. Survivors arrived with photographs and folded letters. Traditionalist Catholics knelt with rosaries, praying for the Pope's conversion. Young Catholics held cardboard signs reading, "No more silence, truth is not rebellion," and "A church that listens is not dead." The air was full of languages: Spanish, English, Portuguese, French, Tagalog, Polish, Italian, Swahili. The same phrases moved through them all. What did he mean? Can he do this? Is this renewal? Is this rupture? Inside the Vatican, the questions were sharper. At 3:40 p.m., the Secretary of State, Cardinal Roberto Mancini, asked for an emergency consultation with senior officials. The meeting lasted 90 minutes and produced a statement that sounded respectful enough to calm casual readers, but not anyone familiar with Rome. The announcements made by the Holy Father, it said, require deep discernment and careful reception in communion with the bishops of the world. The successor of Peter, though entrusted with a unique ministry, acts within the living body of the Church, not outside it. The key sentence was not hard to find. Not outside it. In Vatican language, that was not clarification. It was a boundary marker. By evening, several cardinals were privately calling the speech reckless. One described the tribunal as an importation of secular justice into sacred governance. Another called the financial audits the end of ecclesial sovereignty. A third said the discussion of married priests and women's ministry would open a door that cannot be closed without blood. But for every internal warning, support outside the old centers grew louder. Bishop Leonardo Motta of São Paulo posted a video from a small chapel in the favela where he had worked for years. He did not wear a pectoral cross. He did not sit behind a desk. He stood among people. At last, he said, someone has said what the poor already knew. A church that hides its wounds cannot heal the world. The video reached 5 million views in 3 hours. In Chicago, young Catholics gathered outside a cathedral and read the Beatitudes aloud by candlelight. In Manila, survivors held a silent vigil and placed white flowers on the steps of a parish where abuse allegations had once been ignored. In Nairobi, seminarians wrote a joint letter saying they did not want to inherit a church that taught obedience as fear. The Pope had split the room, but he had opened the square. The next morning, the real counterattack began. At 5:40 a.m., in a conference room inside a residence known informally as Domus Silenti, 11 cardinals met with 2 retired papal diplomats, a senior canon lawyer, and 3 representatives of influential religious congregations. No press was informed. No official agenda existed. The participants arrived separately before dawn. The purpose of the meeting was simple: stop Leo XIV before the reforms became irreversible. According to one person familiar with the discussion, the first strategy was delay. Demand doctrinal clarification. Request global episcopal consultation. Argue that the tribunal could not be established without a broader canonical framework. Insist that financial audits must respect local legal realities. Move everything into committees. The old method. Time as anesthesia. But not everyone in the room believed delay would work. The leaked clips had gone too far. The faithful had heard the speech. Survivors had heard the promise. Young Catholics had heard the invitation. If the Curia simply slowed the process, the Pope could accuse them publicly of obstruction. So a darker phrase entered the meeting. Manifest material error. Not formal heresy, not yet. That would be too dangerous, too dramatic, too easy to challenge. But material error could become a pressure tool, a way to gather signatures, a way to suggest that the Pope had acted outside prudent governance, a way to isolate him without openly attacking the office of Peter. Cardinal Ludovico Ferraro, retired Archbishop of Milan, reportedly said the line that defined the meeting: "A pope cannot govern the church like a prophet on fire. If no one restrains him, The fire will not purify, it will consume. Someone wrote the line down. Someone else leaked it. By noon, the phrase was everywhere. Leo XIV did not respond directly. That was what unsettled his opponents. A man acting impulsively would have answered with anger. He did not. He canceled ceremonial audiences. He met privately with survivors. He named 5 personal consultants, 3 women, a lay theologian, and 1 survivor of clerical abuse, who would advise him directly on the tribunal's design. That last appointment caused a second earthquake. For the first time, the wounded were not being invited to speak at a commemorative event. They were being brought into the room where power was being redesigned. Then Leo left the Vatican on foot. No announcement, no motorcade designed for cameras, no official photographer. He walked to a working-class parish in Trastevere and celebrated Mass with people who had no idea the Pope was coming until he stood at the altar. A nun took a photograph on her phone. Leo kneeling near the back after Mass, head bowed, surrounded by ordinary parishioners. The caption, posted by someone in the parish, read, "I don't know if he is a heretic or a prophet. I only know he is with us." 25 million shares in a single day. That image did what no Vatican communique could do. It made the struggle visible. On one side, meetings before dawn. On the other, a pope kneeling beside people who had never been allowed near the places where decisions are made. The opposition understood the danger immediately, because once the faithful begin to believe a pope is closer to them than to the machinery around him, the machinery loses its natural authority. Then came Omertà Sacra. The title appeared first as a rumor in 3 Italian newsrooms. By 10:05 a.m. the next day, it was no longer a rumor. Pope Leo XIV entered a meeting of the Council for General Affairs without being listed on the schedule. The men inside stood. He did not ask them to sit. He placed a dossier on the table. 412 pages. The cover was white, with the title printed in black letters. Omertà Sacra, sacred silence. The room knew the phrase before anyone opened the file. Omerta was the old code of silence. Sacred silence was what happened when sin learned to wear vestments. Leo placed one hand on the dossier. "This," he said, "is what happens when we protect the institution from the truth. We do not save the church, we teach the church how to lie." Inside the dossier were survivor testimonies, payments disguised as pastoral support, correspondence between diocesan offices, instructions to avoid scandal, travel authorizations for accused priests, records of transfers, and financial trails that connected silence to money. The strongest section came last. Names, dates, files, not anonymous categories, not past failures, not painful mistakes. Names. The Pope looked around the room and said, "If the Church does not clean her own house with humility, the world will do it for us with judgment." Then he left. Within hours, Omertà Sacra was released to selected Catholic media, civil prosecutors, and bishops' conference. The Vatican press office did not soften it. There were no poetic introductions, no defensive paragraphs about all the good work done by the Church, just the documents. No filters, no fog, no incense thick enough to hide the wound. The headlines were immediate. Leo XIV publishes the sins of the Vatican. Pope declassifies abuse and financial files. No more sacred silence. In Ireland, Argentina, Canada, and Mexico, prosecutors announced preliminary reviews. In several dioceses, phones rang without pause. Survivors who had been told for years that records did not exist now saw references to their own cases. Bishops who had slept peacefully under vague internal reports suddenly discovered that the public could read what they had signed. The Curia reacted as if war had been declared. Cardinal Álvaro Ignacio, prefect of the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith, sent a letter to bishops around the world. Recent actions, even when undertaken by the Supreme Pontiff, must be received with prudent reservation, he wrote. The magisterium is not exercised through public release of sensitive materials or external tribunals. Our fidelity is to Christ, not to media pressure. The meaning was not hidden. Do not obey too quickly. More than 70 dioceses responded with ambiguous language. Some praised transparency, but asked for proper ecclesial process. Others declared they would wait for clarification. A few openly rejected cooperation with the tribunal until its canonical status was fully resolved. But the faithful had moved faster than the bishops. In Brazil, religious sisters began organizing survivor support networks. In Canada, parishes voluntarily published financial reports. In Kenya, priests held public listening sessions. In Germany, 200 theologians signed a statement titled, "Leo is not alone." In the United States, Catholic college students launched a campaign demanding that every diocese release abuse-related correspondence within 30 days. The old structure was learning a terrifying truth. Once the center opens the door, the edges do not wait for permission to walk through it. Then came the candlelight vigil. It began as a papal request so simple that no one knew whether it was strategy or prayer. No speeches. "Os peace," the message said. No slogans, only light. At 8 p.m., people began entering St. Peter's Square with candles. Survivors came. Nuns came. Seminarians came. Families came. Priests came. Some cardinals came without photographers. Others watched from windows. By 9, the square was full. No chanting, no banners, no theatrical gestures, only thousands of small flames trembling in the Roman night. At 9:17, Pope Leo XIV appeared on the balcony, holding a single candle. He wore no mitre, no stole, no symbol that made him look larger than the crowd. For a moment, he simply looked out. Then, he knelt. He did not speak, and because he did not speak, the image spoke for him. A Washington Post journalist wrote that night, "Leo XIV does not lead by imposed authority. He leads by shared shame." The phrase traveled. Shared shame. That was why the vigil mattered. It did not pretend the church was innocent. It did not stage a victory for reformers over conservatives. It did not turn victims into props or the Pope into a hero. It simply admitted that something in the body had been wounded and that the first truthful response was not explanation. It was kneeling. The next morning, 93 bishops from 26 countries issued a joint declaration outside the normal channels of the Curia. "The Pope has done what we failed to do," it read. "He has looked victims in the eyes and answered with action, not merely with sorrow. Beginning today, we align ourselves with his vision, even if it cost us office, comfort, or influence." The split was now public. One Vatican followed the Pope, another resisted him, and between them stood millions of Catholics who were no longer content to be spectators. That is when Leo XIV announced Ecclesia 2.0. The name made traditionalists furious before they even read the proposal. It sounded too modern, too technological, too close to the language of the digital world. But Leo had chosen it deliberately. The Church, he said, had always claimed to be universal. Now it would have to prove that universality did not mean sending instructions outward from Rome, but receiving the voices of the faithful back into the heart of the Church. Sunday, noon, St. Peter's Square. The crowd was immense. People filled the square and spilled beyond the barriers. Some had traveled from other countries. Others had simply walked from nearby neighborhoods. They did not know exactly what was coming, but they knew the previous week had changed the meaning of waiting. Leo appeared at the window of the Apostolic Palace in white, without elaborate ceremonial vesture. He looked tired but not weakened. "Today I will not speak to you only as Pope," he began. "I speak to you as a Christian, as a brother, as a sinner who knows the mercy of God." The square quieted. "For too long," he continued. "We believed that protecting doctrine meant listening less. We believed that hierarchy guaranteed truth by itself. We believed that if the people were confused, the answer was more control from above. But the gospel was not first lived by administrators in palaces. It was lived by fishermen, courageous women, children, the sick, the excluded, and the poor. Jesus listened to them first. Then he announced the worldwide consultation. Over the next 180 days, Catholics across the world would be invited to respond through secure multilingual platforms, parish listening centers, universities, religious houses, refugee communities, prison chaplaincies, and rural access points. The questions would not be decorative. Should ordained ministry be open more widely where the Spirit calls? Should the Church reconsider priestly marriage? How should women participate in governance, preaching, and pastoral leadership? How should the Church accompany divorced and remarried Catholics? How should LGBTQ+ Catholics be treated in truth and mercy? How should power be decentralized from Rome? How should bishops be chosen? How should finances be reported? How should survivors be heard? What does it mean to be Catholic in a wounded world? This consultation, Leo said, will not be a performance. It will not be a theater of listening with conclusions already written. The results will be public. Regional synods will be established. The voice of the people will not replace the Holy Spirit. But if we claim the Spirit lives in the whole body of Christ, then we cannot fear the body speaking. Then came the sentence that defined Ecclesia 2.0. If the Holy Spirit guides the Church, why are we afraid to hear Him in the voice of the faithful? The reaction was immediate. In the Philippines, Catholic universities opened volunteer stations within hours. In Uganda, a diocese offered parish offices as digital access centers for rural communities. In Colombia, survivors organized groups to help older Catholics submit testimony. In the United States, several bishops refused participation, claiming that truth is not decided by online survey. But the Pope had anticipated that criticism. This is not voting on Christ, he said. This is asking whether we have failed to recognize Him in those we ignored. The opposition called it chaos. The young called it belonging. Within 2 weeks, the first numbers reached Rome. They were larger than anyone expected. Millions of responses. Then tens of millions. By the end of the consultation period, the final count would exceed 92 million Catholics. Never before had the Church heard so many of its people at once, and never before had so many people discovered how much pain had been waiting under the surface of obedience. The testimonies were not neat. They did not fit ideological boxes. Some were progressive, some traditional, some wounded, some angry, some full of faith, some written by people who had left the Church years earlier and were surprised to find themselves answering. A woman from Medellin wrote, "I was abused by a priest at 14. I do not know if I still believe in the institution, but today someone asked me what I think. That matters." A seminarian in South Korea wrote, "I want to be ordained into a church that tells the truth before it teaches obedience." A mother in Nairobi wrote, "I am divorced. I raised my children in the faith. I still sat in the back because I felt unworthy. I want a church that knows my story before it judges my life." A retired priest in Poland wrote, "Do not destroy the old forms. Reform the hearts that made them empty." A young Catholic in Mexico wrote, "I do not want a church that becomes modern by forgetting God. I want a church that becomes faithful by remembering people." Leo read selections each night. Not all of them. That would have been impossible, but enough to understand the shape of the cry. When an aide suggested summaries, the Pope asked for unedited testimony. "No interpretation before contact," he said. That became another internal phrase. No interpretation before contact. It meant the shepherd must smell the sheep before writing about the flock. 5 months after the first speech, the Clementine Hall was arranged in a way no one in the Curia had ever seen before. No elevated throne, no long hierarchical table, no seating chart that placed cardinals in power and lay people in symbolic corners. A round wooden table stood in the center. Around it sat bishops, lay women, religious sisters, theologians, survivors, youth representatives, Eastern Catholic leaders, parish priests, canon lawyers, and delegates from Africa, Asia, Europe, Latin America, Oceania, and North America. When Pope Leo XIV entered, he carried a folder under his arm. This time the folder was blue. The title on the front was handwritten, Vox Ecclesia, the voice of the Church. He placed it on the table and kept his hand on it for a moment. "Never in the history of the Church," he said, "have we listened to so many people so directly. Never has it been so clear that silence is not peace. Silence is often only pain without permission to speak." Then he opened the folder. The first decree: regional synods would receive binding pastoral authority in defined areas, under communion with Rome but not suffocated by Roman centralization. Local churches would be trusted to respond to local wounds. The second decree: every diocese would establish lay councils with real voting power in areas of finance, safeguarding, education, and pastoral planning. Women would be included by requirement, not invitation. The third decree: a commission on the female diaconate would issue concrete recommendations within 1 year, with women theologians and women religious holding majority representation. The fourth decree: divorced and remarried Catholics would no longer be treated through automatic exclusion. Pastoral discernment would replace blanket denial. LGBTQ plus Catholics would be accompanied without humiliation, with the explicit instruction that no person may be denied dignity in the name of doctrine. The fifth decree: every diocese would publish audited annual financial accounts, and any irregularity would be investigated by an independent ecclesial financial authority. The sixth decree: seminary formation would be rewritten to include trauma awareness, human maturity, ethics, gender dignity, financial accountability, and service among the poor. The seventh decree: abuse cover-up would be treated as a universal canonical crime. An international ecclesial prosecutor's office would investigate cases without hierarchical interference. The eighth decree: episcopal appointments would include structured local consultation. Rome would still confirm bishops, but the people would no longer be treated as strangers to the shepherds sent over them. When Leo finished reading, the room did not applaud, not because people disagreed, because they understood that applause would be too small. An African cardinal rose first. His hands trembled slightly. "Holy Father," he asked, "is this a revolution?" Leo looked at him, then at the table. "No," he said. "It is a public confession that we were wrong not to listen sooner, and now, with love, we correct our course." Outside, the bells of St. Peter's began to ring. Slowly, deeply, the sound moved through Rome like a warning and a promise. In the square, people looked up. Some did not know what had been announced yet. They only heard the bells and felt, in that strange way crowds sometimes feel before they understand, that something had changed. When the decrees became public, reaction moved faster than the Vatican could manage. In Buenos Aires, the Archbishop announced parish assemblies where homilies would be followed by community conversation once a month. In Lagos, young religious sisters launched a social media channel called Theology in Sandals to explain the reforms in language ordinary people could understand. In Krakow, a bishop denounced the decrees as pastoral surrender. The next day, 2,000 Catholics filled his cathedral with signs reading, "Tradition is not sterile repetition, tradition is living memory." In Sydney, giant screens replayed the Pope's words in a public square. People cried openly. Some returned to confession after years away. Others simply stood in silence, unsure whether they were witnessing renewal or the beginning of a division too deep to repair. The division did come. Some parishes refused implementation. Some bishops delayed. A few retired rather than sign the financial disclosure requirements. Traditionalist media warned that the Church had chosen the spirit of the age over the Spirit of God. Progressive commentators demanded even more, saying Leo had opened doors but not walked through all of them. The Pope did not present the reforms as perfect. He called them a beginning. That was important, because the new Church he envisioned was not a utopia and not a surrender. It was a confession that authority without listening becomes deaf, doctrine without mercy becomes stone, and reform without holiness becomes another kind of vanity. A week later, he traveled to Assisi. No grand protocol, no triumphal visit. Only 500 representatives gathered in the city of Francis. Bishops, survivors, monks, nuns, married couples, young Catholics, old Catholics, migrants, theologians, and people who had nearly left the Church but had not yet lost the last thread of hope. At sunset, they gathered with candles. Leo sat on the ground, not on a chair, not above them, on the ground. The image was almost unbearable for the old Vatican imagination, the Bishop of Rome seated in the dust, listening. After a long silence, he spoke without microphone. "Never again a pope alone in his tower," he said. "Never again a church deaf to its people. You are the Church. You are not an audience. You are not an administrative category. You are not a problem to be managed. You are the body of Christ, wounded and alive." No one moved. "If power closes in on itself again like a fortress," he continued, "break the door open in the name of the gospel, not with hatred, not with pride, with truth, prayer, courage, and love." Then he lowered his head. For several minutes there was no sound but the wind moving through the square. Then someone began singing Ubi Caritas. One voice, then another, then hundreds. Different languages, different accents, one melody. Where charity and love are, God is there. That night, a journalist wrote that the Pope had not ended the crisis. He had given the crisis a soul. From that day forward, nothing in the Church returned fully to what it had been. Some communities shrank. Some grew. Some leaders resisted. Others changed. Some people left, convinced the church had betrayed tradition. Others returned, convinced the church had finally told the truth. No single headline could contain it. But one sentence kept returning, whispered in rectories, printed on banners, written in journals, spoken by people who had never expected to care again. A popot. Ku pople est satobu. Tito miki. But that for Almighty said. And the people spoke. That may not solve everything. It may not heal every wound. It may not end every scandal, every abuse of power, every act of cowardice or ambition that still lives inside religious institutions. But it changed the direction of the story. Because for once, the Vatican did not only send a document to the world, it received the voice of the world back into its own heart. And if the gospel means anything, perhaps it means that the shepherd is not diminished when the flock speaks. Perhaps he becomes a shepherd at last. If this story moved you, share your thoughts respectfully below. Tell us where you are watching from and what kind of church you still hope to see. And subscribe for more documentary stories on faith, power, truth, and the moments when history begins to breathe again.